This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. I'm for Northwest Indiana and Northeast Illinois. I'm joined as always by my colleagues and co-hosts, Brian Shrader and Ben Jacob. How are you, fellas?
Very good, Carl. Glad to be here this morning.
I'm doing well, Carl. How are things up north?
All things considered, we're good. A change from our last recording. It's no longer hotter than blazes, and we're not dry as can be either. A little bit of cool down, a little bit of moisture moved through the area. So now we've turned the calendar to the month of July. It's officially time to start talking about diseases, and we have a special treat on hand as we continue our Checking Up with the Doc series. This morning, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Damon Smith at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Smith, welcome to the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast.
Thanks, Carl. Glad to be here.
Very good. Damon, since a lot of our folks don't come from the land of cheese and Packer country, could you please share with the other folks on the ends of these microphones a little bit about yourself? We always get to a kick out of learning the background of our folks here as they join us as guests on the podcast. I know you spent some time out at North Carolina State, similar to Sean Castile. Maybe tell us a little about your tale to get to where you are today.
Yeah, I'm a first-generation college kid and grew up around farms and farming, and just wanted to keep on going, but did it at a slightly different level. So I'm originally from Western New York State, so grew up around muck farms there. Went down to North Carolina State to do my graduate work, and then right after my Ph.D., I ended up at Oklahoma State for 5 years, where I was an extension pathologist there. And about 12 years ago now, I moved to University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I've been here since, and I'm the field crops pathologist and extension specialist. I have responsibilities on corn, soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa for the state.
Excellent. So for those of us that aren't as familiar with Damon's work, he'd be in his role for a longer tenure than what Darcy Jelenko has been down at Purdue here. So, but they both had the same amount of experience on tar spot, as that was a new disease to everybody as Darcy got on board here at the university. So Damon, you guessed it. We would like to visit with you about tar spot. And since you hail from the land of white mold, thought we tap into your advice on how to manage those two diseases. Maybe for folks that got a really bad lick of white mold last year, our advice to them is stay the course in terms of scouting, but you rotated to corn this year. You don't have to worry about white mold in your corn. But in terms of being a little bit more progressive manager of white mold in our soybeans, what would you advise growers as you do up in the great state of Wisconsin?
Yeah, the corn soybean rotation is interesting because you have a non-crop there, and you would think, or non-host crop, and you would think that corn would help reduce the white mold pressure in that corn year. And in fact, it doesn't seem to. and we've been looking at some of the biology around that. So, while the fields that, had white mold last year are probably in corn this year, you're going to need to be thinking about that the next time soybeans are there, because you're not really going to deplete what we call inoculum potential there. So you do need to be a little bit careful. Now, fields that are in soybeans this year, you're definitely going to want to do some scouting. If you have a history there, you're going to want to be focusing on those fields where you've had some white mold in the past. A few things to consider there. If you're in a tilled system, we do still have some farmers here in Wisconsin that do quite a bit of tillage. That type of system does seem to keep white mold moving. And so you can actually bury those sclerotia, the little rat turd things. You can bury those the first time you have white mold, but repeated tillage will actually keep bringing those back to the top, and those things actually survive quite some time, even buried. So you have to be a little bit careful with that. We've been seeing good results in our no-till systems. So some of our farmers that have gone to long-term no-till especially working some small grains. We really like that in the rotation because the small grains, the planting density is good enough that you actually do trick those sclerotia to germinate and form that little mushroom that gives rise to the spores. And so you can actually start to reduce that inoculum potential over time. So that is something to think about if you have those capabilities to take advantage of some small grains and your no-till operation and kind of prolong that rotation a little bit. You can help to reduce that inoculum potential.
Very good. Is the theory there with the no-till operator that you're allowing are we keeping the sclerotia on the soil surface and you're allowing the solar, radiation to beat down and kind of break down that piece of pathogenic material? What's the thought there, Damon? Is it such a nuclear winter Holocaust type of overwintering, structure there?
Yeah. So what's really interesting has been quite a bit of work done on this is what depth those sclerotia are at that are actually viable and active, right? And so, they can be deeply tilled and survive, in a dormant state, but they're not going to contribute to the epidemic because they're buried too deep. It's really the ones in the upper 2-inch profile. Those are the ones that are going to be the ones that are going to risk your crop, right? So what we're trying to do with a no-till is keep those sclerotia in that upper 2-inch profile, and we're trying to trick them to germinate so that we can actually, once those sclerotia kind of germinate and give rise to apothecia, they eventually run out of energy. And so we can actually deplete that inoculum potential in that upper 2-inch profile over time in that no-till system. So it's not that, the environmental weathering is necessarily detrimental. What we're trying to do is just take advantage of the fact that they're all up there potentially, and that we can actually deplete, the viable ones over time. Sure. You do need to be a little bit careful if you decide, you need to, till some headlands or something. You got some compaction. You got to be a little careful because anything that's buried deeper than that 2 inches can be brought back to the top. And those could be viable. So you do need to be a little bit careful there. But we've had some farmers in our driftless region, which is a non-glaciated area, Wisconsin, very hilly, kind of a typical white mold area in the southwest part of Wisconsin. We've had several farmers there adopt a long-term no-till and add some small grains and basically have rotated themselves out of the situation. So it is doable. It takes some patience and some time, but it certainly is something that you can think about on top of, resistant varieties and fungicides and some of these other things that folks want to use to manage the problem.
I appreciate that proactive management strategy. Back to the reactive side, like you led us to. Fungicide timing, that's one thing in discussions with Leighton Petticord, one of our researchers that's doing a lot of modeling for these different things. He made us hip to the idea of a later standard fungicide timing that you all have adopted up north in Wisconsin, which is different from, conventionally here in Indiana, we'll say, make that R1 pass, the first bloom sighted on the main stem, back by R3 when you have an itty bitty pod in the upper foremost nodes. Maybe talk to us about what you and folks up in Wisconsin are doing to manage white mold from a fungicide timing.
Yeah, you're hitting on kind of something that's been drifting over time, and that's really this timing of application. When I got here a decade ago to Wisconsin, we were doing a lot of research with that R1 timing, and that at that time was a really good timing. But things have changed. We're pushing maturity groups a lot of times. We're seeing the weather sort of set up later in the season that's conducive for the fungus. We're seeing more aggressive management, narrower rows, higher plant populations on all these things. And so over the last 4 or 5 years, we've actually seen that optimal timing kind of shift from that R1. We still get decent control at R1. I won't say that that's not an effective timing. But our most effective single application fungicides are really around that R3 timing. So if you can nail it right there, you can get away with one really good application of products at that R3 timing. And that's as good in our work over the last 2 or 3 years. That's been as good as we do a 2-pass Endura at 8 ounces just as a positive check. We wouldn't necessarily recommend that because that's a pretty expensive application. But what that does for us is it it covers that whole bloom time for us, and we can see what single applications might match that 2-pass program there. And we've seen those single applications at R3 do really, really well. The one caveat that we're running into with those R3 timings is by the time you get there, the canopy is really, really dense. And so, canopy fungicide penetration is really something that you have to think about. You have to take some time there. You got to think about maybe carrying a little more water, things that you can do to try to push down through that canopy. We've been doing some work with drop nozzles, which have been effective in terms of boosting the efficacy, if you will, of the products. But there's a lot of logistical issues with trying to drag drop nozzles through R3 soybeans. So, we've been also looking at drone applications and trying to use downdraft to try to push fungicide down in there. And we've had some pretty effective results with that. And we're continuing to test that. So you do need to think about, how am I actually going to get that fungicide down in there? Take some time, especially if you're only going to go that one pass. I think carrying a little more water, going a little bit slower, and just being a little more meticulous about that application is key at that R3 timing.
Damon, can you talk us through the biology of this? Because this seems a little bit almost counterintuitive to what we've all been taught about white mold, in terms of a flower is there, so you have the potential for infection. If we wait till the R3 time frame, my mind says, man, that's a long time to leave your plant unexposed. But I'm familiar with your work and the results that you've talked about. Can you talk to us why this works and the biology of it? Because it does seem so counterintuitive to what we all know about white mold and how it progresses through the plant.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Brian. If the mushrooms, a little apothecia is there, right? So that's the thing that gives rise to spores, and it looks like a little number 2 pencil eraser kind of right on the surface of soil. If that thing is there at R1, it's certainly going to be infecting flowers that are present at that time. We do quite a bit of work where we actually track the development of those apothecia in the field. And so we're actually physically out there and we're looking at them, and we're trying to track when they actually appear relative to when the canopy closure happens and relative to the phenology of the soybean plant. And what we've seen happen is that the formation of those little mushrooms is actually shifted in time. So it's not that the plant's at risk at R1, but the mushrooms aren't quite there yet. And so that's really what's going on, as we've seen a bit of a shift in terms of where the disease triangle actually lines up. And that's where the key is. So where we have that susceptible host, where we have the environment, and where the pathogen is actually forming those mushrooms has drifted into time a little bit. And again, there's a lot of reasons for that. We're pushing maturity group, which sort of then drags bloom time out a little bit for us. We actually, we're trying to sort of balance where we're protecting blooms the most. And what I think is going on with our R1 applications is we're almost a little bit too early, and we're missing protection of a lot of the blooms later on in that system there. So, just by delaying that a little bit, you can sort of cover it pretty well. I do have a lot of farmers that can get concerned. All right, if I wait till R3, am I then going to miss that? That is a valid concern, especially a year like this year where, at least for us, we're pretty wet. And so, we might run the risk of actually not being able to get in a field in some cases. So in that case, we've seen some R2, so full bloom applications. That's okay too. It might not be the absolutely optimal best timing, but you're going to do a pretty darn good job, because again, you're balancing the number of blooms out there and your ability to protect them. And that gives you some wiggle room. If you're going to go at R2, you got all the way till R3, or even a little bit into early R4 to get that fungicide on. So that helps your window of opportunity a little bit and doesn't sort of back you into a corner in terms of the weather.
I'm hearing a lot of parallels in terms of, management of foliar diseases in corn, right? A lot of folks habitually will make that pass at tassel time, because that's when they've been told the best results are. But if you don't have the disease really ramped up and prevalent within the canopy, are we are we going too early, to your point, Damon? I know that you've had a hand in the development of some tools that folks can use to help aid in those decisions, a Sporecaster being one of them on the white mold side of things. For folks that aren't initiated, would you mind sharing a little bit more about that tool and how they might use it this year?
Yeah, so the science side of me, I'm actually trained as an epidemiologist and modeler, and I've been doing that kind of deep modeling work for over 20 years now. And so it's sort of, when I got here, it sort of was natural and to start trying to understand the epidemiology and work that into a decision support tool. And so our first product out of the gate was Sporecaster, which is our white mold prediction tool. And what that actually does is it looks at weather information in a GPS coordinate that hits on your phone, or you drop a pin for a field that you're interested in. It goes up to the cloud, it pulls down weather data for that GPS coordinate, and then it runs it through some models that we've developed. And those models actually look at apothecial development. So all that work where we were actually going through and actually looking at when those apothecia are developing relative to the phenology of soybeans has been worked into that tool. And so that tool can be used to kind of optimize that timing, right? So you're still going to want to shoot between R1 and R3, but what the tool can do is it takes that disease triangle concept and it sort of places it right at the perfect timing. So when do those three things really line up right at the right timing? And that's what the tool can really do, so that you can really optimize that application or product. Some years, like last year in Wisconsin, we were so hot and dry, the tool really didn't tell us to spray too much. I mean, we had some pockets in Wisconsin that needed some fungicide, but we certainly saved a lot last year, especially folks that looked at that tool. But I think this year, a lot of folks are going to have to spray, and so that tool is really going to optimize where that needs to go in that R1 to R3 timing. And we continue to test that product or that tool, and we've seen it do really well, in our research. And I know some of my colleagues, including Darcy and Darren Mueller at Iowa State, they've been taking a look at that tool as well, and it seems to do a pretty good job of again optimizing that or telling you whether you need that product or not. The other tool we have is Tar Spotter. So Tar Spot on corn, we've developed a tool there. It's a similar concept and framework. Once we had the framework all set up for Sporecaster, it seems sort of natural to be able to pivot it. We use different data sets, different training data sets, of course, based on Tar Spot development. But we've developed that tool, and that can do the same thing, help you kind of optimize where that application is going to be, tell you whether you really need it or not. Where I've seen a lot of good success is where folks plan on doing, say, like a VTR1 application, a fungicide in corn, and then they'll use it to see if they actually need to come back again with a second pass. Some years, really bad years, so 2018, 2021, those were pretty significant tar spot years for us here in Wisconsin. We saw some two-pass programs with some decent success. I don't think that's going to be all years, to see a two-pass be really economically viable and give you some positive return. But in those really bad years, that tool can help you make that decision or not, whether you need that second pass.
I appreciate you helping us make the transition there. I think that's probably the number one question that we get when it comes to tar spot management. It boils down to, do I need to budget in a second fungicide, and having a tool to help make that decision? That's really some kind of leading edge type of research. I remember us learning a lot about tar spot from our Southern Wisconsin colleagues in 2018. To your point, tar spot it moved further south. Maybe not quite down to Bend in the Terre Haute area, but certainly down to my southern bounds. Maybe tell us a little bit about what we thought we knew at that point, and then what we do know with a greater degree of certainty today, Damon, after having going on 6 years of experience with this pathogen.
Yeah, this is a unique pathogen. It's something that breaks the rules a little bit, if so to speak. It didn't really read the plant pathology textbooks, and so we came in 2018 sort of thinking, if it rains a lot and it's cool, we're gonna have lots of tar spot, and we even did some heavy irrigation events in some of the subsequent years to try to increase tar spot in our research trials, and we would get skunked. And so it's just really odd, it's different, than say like northern corn leaf blight, which we have lots of experience with, right? The wetter it is, the cooler it is, the more, northern corn leaf blight you get. And so we spent a lot of time really digging into the data, right? Looking at data that we had accumulated from 2018 onward, and the models that we actually developed for the tar spotter tool not only were useful for development of the tool, but it helped us understand really what are the fundamental weather conditions that really are important for this particular disease. And it's really interesting. Yes, we need cool conditions, and temperature is a big driver. But we learned, in 2021, high temps aren't lethal. Okay, so when we get really hot and dry, the fungus definitely slows down. But those conditions don't kill the fungus, right? So if you return to kind of cooler conditions, that can start to ramp back up again. So you need not let your guard down if it gets hot and dry. The other really important piece is that we learned is that you actually have to have these wet, dry cycles, right? And so I think, we're still working on really trying to understand the real fundamental reasons for this, but I think that's somewhat tied to corn phenology. And then again, when the spores are actually being released into the canopy and when they're germinating and all these sorts of things. But if you look at 2018 and then again in 2021, those were really bad epidemics. And it was interesting here in Wisconsin, we were wet around planting time. Then we got really hot and dry in July. And then it got cool and wet again in August, and that's when everything just really blew up. So we had an epidemic sort of initiate early on at the end of June or early part of July. It kind of sat there a little bit, didn't do too much, and then when the conditions really got conducive again in August, it just really blew up. We saw some significant yield losses. We saw folks miss fungicide applications and all those sorts of things. Same thing in 21, same way, it was wet, then hot, dry, and wet again. If you look at what we're seeing now, we've got Indiana, Iowa. There's parts of these states and a few counties that are positive already. If we get hot and dry and then it gets wet again, I'd be on the lookout. I think it's going to be one of these years where we could potentially see some heavier tar spot. We've been looking in our plots. We can't seem to find tar spot yet. That makes some sense to me though, because the last year was so hot and dry, we really didn't have much tar spot. And I think the inoculum potential there, the residual inoculum potential from last year is actually pretty low for us. If you look at the areas that are showing tar spot right now, they actually had a kind of a late epidemic, which I think is contributing to some of the inoculum potential that was available already this spring. So there are some of those things that we're still trying to understand in terms of survivability and those sorts of things. But I think it's going to be a year that we really need to pay attention to this disease because we're kind of setting up like we did in 2018 and in 21.
Very good. Well, I know we've moved well past, the idea of there being a threshold, if you will, a chart that says at X, cost for your fungicide at this, dollar for your corn market. But if folks are not going to leverage a tool like the Tar Spotter app, and they are out there scouting their fields and they come across something they believe to be tar spot, we all understand the diagnostic tool that rubs off it's not tar spot if it's embedded within the leaf and it looks like a fleck of tar. Sure is. Send that to Purdue University to confirm at our plant diagnostic lab free of charge. All of that boilerplate aside, how would you recommend somebody proceeding if they find tar spot in their field and it's at a very nominal level? They found some, and they want to be, a proactive manager. How would you recommend they follow that disease progression from there?
Yeah, I think the first two things I would say is be patient, and then don't get tar spot tunnel vision. Those are the first two key pieces. Yeah. The patience thing I think is really important. So, yes, it can show up now. We're in Wisconsin. We've got a lot of, V6 to V8 corn right now. It can show up this early. The key is that those leaves, especially if we're looking at say like a V5, V6, where some of the early tar spot did show up, those leaves aren't going to be on those plants later on, right? And you really, to really maximize that fungicide product, you want it to be on leaves that you want to protect and are going to be contributing to yield. Yes, the fungus is active. That's a clue for you, but you need to be patient at that early, growth stage and wait till you get to that tassel timing. There's been lots of research, even out of the bad years, 2018, 2021. We know the optimal timings fall after that tassel timing all the way on up into R3, right? So that window of opportunity is quite wide. It makes good sense because you're protecting that upper third of the canopy primarily. That's where you want your fungicide primarily is protecting that upper third. That's where a lot of the yield potential is coming from with grain. And, then you can start making some decisions on, all right, should I go at tassel, R1, and then do I do a 2-pass, or am I going to just lock myself into a single pass and some of those things, right? And you do need to make some considerations there. Again, something like tar spotter can be useful if you want to go with that VT, but you want to sort of cover all the bases using the tar spotter app to, answer the question, do I need to come back with a second pass, right? So that's one way of doing it. We have a lot of success here where we maybe wait just a little bit into that kind of R2 time frame. We have a lot of difficulty getting airplanes up here. So, what I tell a lot of our farmers is if you're going to make the decision, you're probably only going to be able to get one pass on. Sure. You're going to make that decision around tassel, and hopefully the plane gets here by R3, right? So anywhere in there, we've done lots of timing studies, regional timing studies with Darcy and some others, and we know that anywhere in there really is an optimal timing. Some years the 2-pass is going to be good, but again, you do need to sit down and think about the economics of this a little bit. Price out that product that you're going to use. Think about, what it's going to cost to actually get the application out. And then you're figuring probably, in a bad tar spot year, you're probably looking at 8 to 10 bushels on average from that product or that program, right? So, sit down. Those economics aren't terribly hard to figure out, but pencil them out, take that time, and make sure you're not in a negative return on investment scenario there. We do know in the heavy disease years, fungicides are, stand to pay or have odds to pay a little higher there in the bad disease years. The other thing is in these northern locales, we do need to balance northern corn leaf blight and occasionally gray leaf spot, right? So you have to kind of also look at what other diseases are in play. And for us, having a little later application timing helps cover our bases on northern corn leaf blight, especially in our silage acres where we have a lot of BMRs that are tend to be, somewhat susceptible. So that's the other key piece is if you think you're going to get maybe southern rusts in your locales, maybe late northern, or you got some active gray, think about product and then timing relative to tar spot and try to balance all those diseases that you got going on, or at least are a concern. Luckily, a lot of the fungicide products out there cover all those diseases, right? So you do have lots of good options there. So, pricing some things out locally and just trying to balance that whole thing. And again, be patient and don't get that tar spot tunnel vision.
Perfect. Ben, representing the folks down south that are experiencing tar spot for the first time, other maybe rudimentary questions. I know we've covered this topic many times over the years, but with a newer audience that's tuned into this subject, anything that we should ask Dr. Smith while I've got him on the line?
Yes, well, I appreciate him calling out southern rust specifically and the comment to not get tunnel vision on tar spot. It's not that it's new here, it's just that it's a harvest disease for us. Typically, we would find it in September, really at the earliest, and we found it at the beginning of June. So it's just a little bit different dynamic this year, but it's worth mentioning that it looks like a very active hurricane season ahead of us, so that southern rust threat is real this year. I think the question that I would ask as I look across just the variability in our plants, in our planting dates rather, we have corn that tasseled 2 weeks ago, was probably the earliest, and then we have some corn that's V5, V6, and so that corn that just tasseled, we're already in the management, actively managing the disease in it. But when you have such variability, and sometimes those two fields could be just across the road from each other this year. So if you have that corn that's canopied, and you have disease buildup in it, how much risk, if any, does that add to some of the younger corn if we stick in this wet pattern we've been here for the past 7 days?
Yeah, that's a good question. When it comes, if you think about tar spot, we do know that the spores can move some distance. We don't know exactly how far, but there's been a couple of papers that suggest at least a mile, maybe even 2 miles from a point source, right? So it's certainly possible that if you had higher levels of active tar spots, say in that VT field, that could certainly be contributing inoculum to that V5 corn or V6 corn that might be across the road. That's certainly a potential. I would say, again, those leaves just aren't going to be there. So if you can hold off, that would be great, because if you spray that early, you're almost certainly going to need to come back during the tassel time, especially if you have southern rust active along with tar spots. So you're almost certainly looking at a 2-pass program if you go ahead and spray at that V5 timing. Well, I'm not necessarily a proponent of that timing here in Wisconsin. We rarely see positive economic returns here. I do understand the southern rust problem, and so if that's the case, putting on a cheaper product early on, and then making that decision to come back with something that has good tar spot efficacy, probably in that VT to R3 window, is probably the thing that's gonna pay in that situation. That is a problem, this year that we're looking at, is a lot of unevenness in terms of corn crops. Like I said, we've got some V8 stuff, and then we've got some stuff that's like V3 right now, right? So it's certainly going to be variable. And we have the added problem again with just the logistics here in Wisconsin. So, just trying to get planes at the right time. Sometimes the planes blow through, and, you get one opportunity. And if that's the case for you all, if you gotta go, I'm not going to tell you not to. I think, you got to take the opportunity when you can. And I do think fungicide is going to be needed in a lot of acres this year, just looking at, like you said, the hurricane potential for you all in the southern part of Indiana. We're looking at, these fronts that keep moving out of Minnesota and Iowa. That's bringing, cool conditions, wet weather for us. So it's certainly going to be a diseasey year. And again, I think that's where we're going to see a lot of return on these products, is in a year where it's diseasey. Last year, 2023, I'd be telling you not to be using fungicides, right? Because we didn't see a lot of positive returns last year. It was just so dry, not conducive. We didn't have that disease triangle. So again, just trying to balance that, know what you're going after, and then resist the temptation again of getting that tunnel vision.
Yeah, I think with the southern rust risk, and it's been a while since we've had a heavy southern rust year, we have generally trended later with our fungicide applications to try and protect as much of grain fill as possible. I would say that a brown silk application is fairly standard at this point, especially if we think that, two things. If we have a lot of June planted corn, we pretty much know that southern rust is going to show up early and aggressive that year. It just seems to be the way it goes. So the other question that I'd ask involves some of the weather that we had recently, kind of along the I-70 corridor on the west side of the state, over into around Paris, Illinois, Marshall, Illinois. There was a lot of wind a week ago tomorrow, and in some places enough hail that it doesn't matter, but in other places just enough to kind of tatter the leaves a little bit. The corn was laid down almost flat on the ground. As we look at disease progression in general, because we have some heavy gray pressure already this year too. How much concern does that add that plant's been down in the mud and the leaves have been tattered?
Yeah, we certainly can see, some conditions there that'll favor, disease potential there. Hopefully the corn will try to stand back up a bit, and that'll help relieve some of that. When we talk about hail, a lot of times the concern then becomes bacterial diseases, right? So wind-driven rain along with those hail events. Those are the kind of the diseases of concern. Unfortunately, the fungicides don't address those issues, right? So you do need to be a little bit careful on, where are we going to use those, and then how bad does the crop actually look, right? I would say, if a crop is just really hammered and it doesn't look like it's going to recover, I don't know if I'd prioritize fungicide necessarily on that particular acre, right? So that's something a little counterintuitive to like what you're thinking about, but those fungicides really are going to be more helpful to a plant that can still grow, set good yield, and make it to the end of the season, right? So just kind of think about that a little bit and be aware that, a fungicide isn't going to take care of a bacterial problem. It's certainly going to take care of a gray problem. And when it comes to, say, a gray leaf spot, I would use those lower leaves to try to, make some decisions on where I want to place that fungicide on that particular acre. We do know that you can use those lower leaves sort of as an indicator. So once you get about 5% on about 50% of those lower leaves, it's go time for a gray leaf spot, right? We've done quite a bit of work in the years past to look at that particular disease. So, using those lower leaves, trying to do some scouting, and then making that decision is probably the way to go on those particular acres. So you just need to be a little bit careful where you're going to put that, in my opinion. There was some work done a few years ago, again, out of Darren Mueller's lab, where they did some hail damage work looking at fungicide return on investment. It was hard to tease out on really severely hail damaged corn. They used an ice machine to blast some corn and then put some fungicides on. It was hard to really tease out a positive return there. So again, when the damage is just so much, you're not, that fungicide can't it can't come down from the heavens and save the plant. So just be careful there. Be a little bit picky on where you're going to spend that money, and I would put that money on the higher yield potential acres.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out. And I think the way that we've talked about it on this program in the past, and which is not unique to us, I'm not saying it is, but the fungicides protect yield. They don't add yield. Right? So if you have an area with high yield potential, you have more yield to protect. If you can humor me for one more, it's backtracking to the white mold conversation, which admittedly is not something that I deal with year in and year out. I have one random pocket kind of southeast of Indy that it shows up every few years for some inexplicable reason. But if you're thinking through the single shot fungicide application and going from the maturities that you all are using up north and moving into central Indiana, where maybe we're more centered around a group 3 bean with more pod fill and flowering on the back end, and honestly, R3 probably is a longer window in it. Does that change any of your thoughts around that single shot with the stretched out reproductive window?
It does a little bit, actually. We've done some work. For our farmers, this is a little bit playing with fire, in my opinion, but we have done some work with some R4 applications of product. We've even gone into R5. We definitely see by R5, those pods are filling out and everything. That's too late. You're not going to, fix that situation. But the early R4 applications, we still have seen some success, which sort of surprised us a little bit. Again, I'd sort of, in our locale, we're growing a lot of 2s to, maybe some 3s in the very southern part of Wisconsin. Again, pushing that just into that R3 window a little bit, I do think, helps maximize that where we're trying to push maturity groups, right? And here in Wisconsin, what happens too a lot of times is that we'll push a maturity group and then we get cool. And so what that does is it's sort of a double ding with a semi-indeterminate soybean where you'll have bloom time that normally might be 2, maybe 3 weeks. Now we're talking like 4 weeks, maybe even, sometimes there's blooms out 5 weeks long. That's still a window for the fungus, right? And so again, if you're thinking about how do I best balance blooms and pods, right? By pushing that just a little bit on those longer maturity groups, you sort of balance that application a little better, and you sort of maximize the protection, if you will, on the most parts of the plant, right? We've also seen farmers plant a very early soybean on the early side and in terms of planting date, and they can basically escape white mold. So that's the other thing you have to think about too is what was your planting date, and then is that maturity group actually a little bit short for maybe your zone, because that'll actually compress that bloom time down or make the bloom time out of sync with when the little mushroom is out, right? And so then you just move the whole disease triangle around and broke it. And so you actually don't need a fungicide in that case. And we see some farmers that do that here. Yes, they give up a little bit on yield, but they're trying to balance that with the early planting date, and white mold can be so bad that they're okay giving up a little bit if they can manage the white mold problem. So kind of think about that. A late, where I get really concerned is where we plant a long maturity group late. That really opens up the window of opportunity. We actually do that in my program. We actually push maturity groups a little bit, and then we plant late. And that really makes the white mold situation ramp up for us so that we can get good efficacy data. So that was a roundabout way of just, saying, yes, I like the fact on those longer maturity groups, maybe just pushing into that R3 a little bit, trying to, again, just balance coverage of that product.
Yep. Very good. That's all I've got, Carl.
No, appreciate that. Good conversation. Damon, you've given us a good prescription here for managing field crop diseases for 2024. Know that your work isn't constricted to just tar spot and white mold. Your thoughts on, maybe sharing with the rest of our audience some of the other work that you're proud of, interests that you have. I know you'd mentioned deep modeling, maybe a definition for some of our audience would be welcome there. And other highlights from your program and otherwise.
Yeah, we also do quite a bit of fusarium work, so fusarium head blight on wheat, and then we're also doing some work on, we have a lot of silage corn acres here in Wisconsin, about 1 million acres of silage corn grown in the state. And so we've been also doing a lot of work on fusarium and deoxynivalenol mycotoxin problems in corn silage. And so that's been a big piece what we've been doing lately, in addition to the tar spot and white mold work. And then I'm also an affiliate with a data science institute here at UW-Madison, which is kind of a unique group here where we're doing a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning work with that group. And what we're wanting to do is really push our modeling. So we've up to this point been using maybe more traditional approaches in terms of modeling, but we're really trying to push towards machine learning. We'd like to really get multiple diseases into a modeling environment to be able to push better tools out to farmers that are research-based tools. And so that's become a big part of my program. I actually have a postdoc right now. She's kind of leading that work, and we've been working with that Data Science Institute on that as well. So a lot of areas in my program. It's a pretty active program. I actually have a small soybean breeding program housed inside my pathology program, which a lot of folks don't know about. We actually don't have a soybean breeder here, so I'm kind of an amateur soybean breeder on the side. I've always had an interest in resistance and developing varieties with good disease resistance, so that was sort of natural for me when I got here. So we've actually released some 4 varieties actually. Last year we released to our foundation seeds program. Those are conventionals, so mainly pitched towards our organic market. We're the second in the country with organics here, and especially organic grain production in Wisconsin. So that's been a big sort of push in the state. So having some varieties out there available for our organic farmers with good levels of partial resistance, especially against white mold and some of the other diseases, is key in those, especially the transition acres here in Wisconsin.
Excellent. No, very, very interesting. Not your father's pathologist, Damon. It sounds like, between the breeding, the modeling, and also the actual work of field crop pathology. So appreciate you sharing a little bit of that with us. If folks wanted to keep up with your research and your contributions to the field, where might they take a peek?
Yeah, the best place to go is badgercropdoc.com. So that's my website. It is a .com website, not a .edu website. So badgercropdoc, all one word, .com. But that's where I post a lot of our state-centric stuff. So Wisconsin stuff goes there. Then our extension service picks that up and it'll distribute it around as well. And then the other good place to look that I'm a contributor of is the Crop Protection Network as well. So those two places, if you just really want to geek out to some disease stuff, those are probably the two best places to look and especially follow the work that I do here in Wisconsin and regionally as well.
Very good. Brian, Ben, anything else for Dr. Smith before we let him get back to his work? Good work today.
The only thing I'm going to ask is about this modeling real quick, Carl. I see this as kind of the next horizon for not only ag, but for a lot of other industries, but certainly in agriculture. And I guess maybe just peer into your crystal ball for a little bit, Damon, just briefly, and talk to us a little bit about having been involved in modeling for as long as you have, having this part of your program. Talk to us a little bit about what you see the future of modeling look like for agriculture over even, say, short-term next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, sort of a slow slog for the last 20 years, right? We were using really pretty traditional approaches, right? So some sort of old school statistics approaches and those sorts of things. And then the really frustrating part for me is while we were developing those tools, we weren't getting them deployed. Right. So we would develop them, they'd sit in the literature and they weren't really helping the farmers. And then, I sort of blame, if you will, the iPhone, right? That changed our world, right? And I took advantage of it. We decided, hey, we're gonna develop an app, and it took us a little bit of time to kind of figure out, all right, how do we pull the weather information down? How do we integrate it into an app and everything? But we're sort of over that hurdle. And so I see this really as an exponential increase, right? So we were in the sort of the flat part of a curve, right, over the last 20 years. And if you look at what's been going on, even the last just 1 year, we are in the exponential increase in terms of, models that are going to be coming out. And then I think ease of adoption, right? And I think as we're able to run machine learning tools, locally on either a computer or even natively in your iPhone or your Android phone, there's a huge amount of opportunity here to take advantage of that. And we're going to be able to actually tie multiple diseases. I'm sort of disease centric, but we're going to be able to tie multiple diseases into the whole scheme, right? Because we get asked a lot, like, how do you sort of prioritize which disease you're going to go after? That's a great question, right? Let's let some machine learning, let's work that out in the AI environment, and we can then, help folks through that process, right? Can we then tie, those disease models, if we think holistically about the disease triangle, there's a lot of opportunities there as well to pull in growth stage models, other weather systems, running multiple weather systems at the same time to really improve the accuracy here. So what I see in like 5 years is we're going to be running multi-disease dashboards that are going to be fully integrated, thinking about the whole disease triangle, right? And you could even think about probably layering spore catch data on top of that. So that's the other area in pathology right now that's been really ramping up, is how do we take spore trap data, how do we get it in real time, how do we model those events, and then tie that into our sort of holistic mechanistic approach to modeling. So it's a really exciting time, in agriculture right now with machine learning and AI, and I think we're sitting in a place, especially in pathology, where we're going to see a lot of really cool tools coming along, I'd say, in the next 3 to 5 years.
That's perfect. Just excited to see what that does, just because it could help, like you mentioned, day to day in the field operationally make some of these ROI decisions that we've talked about much easier, perhaps.
That's right. Yeah. Farmer doesn't care about, when it's optimal to apply for tar spot. Like you said, don't get tar spot tunnel vision, Damon. It's about the whole disease spectrum that you face out there in the cornfield. So we're contributing to that perspective. I think is welcomed by growers and industry advisors alike. In the spirit of keeping us on track with the checking up with our doc series, is there a referral to another office that you might make? Maybe a colleague, in the same field, same geography, further afield, where might you point us?
Yeah, probably one of my favorite colleagues is Dr. Darren Mueller at Iowa State. Don't tell him I said one of my favorites; it'll go to his head. But he's super sharp, got a lot of experience. He's been working on white mold actually longer than I have. He was here at Wisconsin and in his earlier days, and worked with my predecessor on that. And then he's got quite a bit of experience working with Allison Robertson on tar spot as well, and in Iowa. So he'd be an excellent contributor. He also has a lot of experience with Cercospora and frog eye leaf spot and soybeans and some of these other diseases that I don't typically work with so much because we're just a little bit far north and we're on sort of the edge of some of those diseases, but he'd bring a really great perspective to the disease discussion.
Excellent. No, thank you. This has been a treat, Damon. So thank you for indulging our request to talk a little bit wider geography, things of concern, lending your expertise on white mold, tar spot, and then also your contributions to the conversation in terms of the modeling space. I think folks will enjoy that side of our recording today. So appreciate your time. Looking forward to welcoming you back to the podcast, perhaps another year or two into the future to check in on some of those contributions in the the machine learning, the AI space, as you get to actually be part of those shaping those conversations. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this week's edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. Brian Shrader, if folks wanted to keep up in Northeast Indiana, how may they do so?
Yep. The best way to keep up with me would be on Instagram, B_K_Shrader. And Ben, how about you?
Yep. You can find me on X at the Ben Jacob, or slightly more active on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. How about you, Carl?
I'd give you more than slightly active. Ben Jacob is at a renaissance in agronomy content in the social media space, and I am enjoying that as audience member. So definitely check in with Ben if you haven't here in a minute. And if you want to do the same on Twitter, or on X, that's at Joern, CJOERN, or on Facebook at Joern Agronomy. And as always, thanks for spending a little bit of your day with us, learning about all things agronomy in the great state of Indiana and further afield. And give us a like and a subscribe. Could always use a rating and review to help more folks find the work of this team. And as always, should you have any content suggestions, door is always open. But with that, we will wrap up this edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast, and we'll see you down the road.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.